What happens when a man who's built walls around his heart meets two little souls with nowhere else to go? They say the harshest storms reveal what we're truly made of. Some will turn away, others will pass by, eyes downcast. But sometimes the most unlikely hero is the one who stops. This is the story they didn't want told, about how two little girls with nothing left changed a man who thought he had nothing to give. If you stay until the end, you'll discover how a single act of compassion can ripple through generations, and why some of the greatest heroes of the West were deliberately erased from our history books. If this is your first time here, I'm sharing untold stories of black heroes from America's past on the Black Rancher channel. Hit subscribe now and ring that bell so you never miss these powerful tales that deserve to be told. Now let's dive into Chapter 1 of a story that will change how you see the American frontier forever. Texas, April 1885. Solomon Soul Hayes rode into Cottonwood Springs with the sun at his back and dust on his trail. At 38, he was a man who'd long ago learned to travel light and alone. Tall and powerfully built, with broad shoulders and skin the color of burnished mahogany, he commanded a quiet respect that came not from intimidation, but from the steady confidence in his gaze. Saul adjusted his well-worn black Stetson against the late afternoon glare. The small cattle town seemed quiet, too quiet for a Saturday. Usually, cowboys would be pouring into saloons after a week's hard work, but the main street was nearly deserted. As he guided his chestnut stallion toward the livery stable, he noticed the church doors were open, with a small gathering of people dressed in black filing out. A funeral. In a town this size, everyone would attend, regardless of whether they knew the deceased. "Afternoon," Saul greeted the stable hand, an elderly white man with gnarled hands who barely glanced up as he approached. "Mind looking after Caesar here while I get some supplies?" The old man squinted at Saul, his weathered face inscrutable. "2 bits. You staying long?" "Just passing through," Saul replied, the same answer he'd given in every town for the past 15 years. Since the war ended, he'd worked his way across 5 states, never settling, never attaching. A former Buffalo soldier turned cowhand, he'd found that constant movement kept the memories at bay. "Might want to avoid Larson's General Store then," the stable hand muttered, taking Caesar's reins. "Owner don't take kindly to your kind unless you're buying from the back door." Saul nodded, unsurprised. "The funeral? Anyone I should know about?" "Margaret Daniels. Fever took her 3 days ago." The old man spat tobacco juice into the dirt. "Right shame. Husband passed last winter. Leaves behind them twin girls." Something in the man's tone made Saul pause. "Family taking them in?" "Ain't got none," the stable hand said, already turning away. "Town's taking up a collection. Reverend's wife might take 'em in, or the orphanage in Austin." Saul felt a familiar tightness in his chest, the same feeling he got before a storm broke. He'd learned long ago not to get involved in other people's troubles. A black man traveling alone through the West survived by minding his own business. "Where would I find a decent meal in town?" he asked, changing the subject. "Mrs. Patterson runs a clean boarding house 2 streets over. She don't turn nobody away if they got coin and manners." 20 minutes later, Saul sat at Mrs. Patterson's long dining table, the only customer at this odd hour between lunch and supper. The middle-aged widow had served him without comment, placing a steaming plate of beef stew, cornbread, and greens before him with a simple, "Eat while it's hot." He was halfway through his meal when the front door opened and the Reverend entered, his black coat dusted with the dry Texas soil. Behind him, 2 little girls with matching dark braids and somber blue dresses clutched each other's hands. They couldn't have been more than 6 years old. "Afternoon, Martha," the Reverend said to Mrs. Patterson. "The council's still deliberating. Thought the girls could use a meal while we wait." Saul kept his eyes on his plate, but he couldn't help noticing how the twins stared at their shoes, their identical faces streaked with dried tears. "Poor lambs," Mrs. Patterson murmured, ushering the girls to a table far from Saul's. "I'll fix them something straight away." The Reverend nodded gratefully, then noticed Saul. A flicker of surprise crossed his face before he composed himself. "Good day to you, sir. Passing through?" "Yes, sir," Saul replied, keeping his tone respectful. Experience had taught him how to navigate these interactions. Just stopped for a meal before moving on. The Reverend seemed about to say more when the door burst open again. A red-faced man in a sheriff's badge stormed in, followed by 2 town councilmen. "It's decided, Reverend," the sheriff announced without preamble. "We've telegraphed the orphanage in Austin. They'll send someone to collect the girls next week." One of the twins let out a small whimper. "Now, Sheriff," the Reverend began, "surely we can—" "We've taken a vote," one councilman interrupted. "Town can't afford to keep them. Nobody's adopting 2 mouths to feed, not with times being what they are." "The girls have their mother's house," Mrs. Patterson interjected, setting plates before the twins. "Worth next to nothing," the other councilman scoffed. "And who'd buy it now? It'll be sold to cover burial costs." Sewell kept eating, though the food had lost its taste. This wasn't his business. He'd be gone by morning, miles away from this town and its problems. The men continued arguing in hushed tones, but Sewell's attention was drawn to the twins. One was silently crying into her untouched food, while the other stared directly at him with eyes too old for her young face. For the briefest moment, Sewell saw himself at that age, lost, afraid, watching strangers decide his fate. He set down his fork, paid Mrs. Patterson, and headed for the door. As he passed the twins' table, the staring girl suddenly reached out and caught his sleeve. "Mister?" Her voice was barely a whisper. Sewell stopped, aware of the sudden silence in the room, of all eyes on him. "You have kind eyes," the little girl said, "like our papa did." Her sister looked up then, her tear-streaked face a mirror image. "Are you an angel?" she asked with childish directness. A lump formed in Saul's throat. "No, little one, just a traveler." "Where are you going?" the first twin asked. "West," Sewell answered simply. "To California eventually." The sisters exchanged a look that seemed to contain an entire conversation. Then both girls spoke in perfect unison. "Can we come with you?" The room fell silent. Sheriff Wade's hand instinctively moved toward his holster, while the councilmen exchanged nervous glances. The Reverend stepped forward, placing a gentle hand on one twin's shoulder. "Now, girls, that's not appropriate. The gentleman is just passing through." Sewell stood frozen, uncomfortably aware of every eye in the room. The logical part of him, the survivor, screamed to walk away. A black man traveling with 2 white children would face questions, suspicion, and danger at every turn. "I'm afraid not," he said finally, his voice low and steady. "The trail's no place for little ones." The hope in their identical faces crumpled. The quiet twin began sobbing again, while her sister's expression hardened with determination. "We won't be trouble," she insisted. "We can cook, Mama taught us, and clean and sew. Papa said we're smart as whips." "Emma, that's enough," the Reverend admonished gently. Sewell looked at the clergyman. "These are the Daniels girls?" The Reverend nodded. "Emma and Sarah. Their parents were good people. Thomas Daniels was our town blacksmith until pneumonia took him last winter. Margaret tried to keep his shop running while caring for the girls, but—" "Waste of time discussing this," Sheriff Wade cut in. "2 white orphans going with a—" He caught himself, glancing at the Reverend. "It ain't happening. The council's decided. They're going to Austin." Sewell knew he should leave. This wasn't his fight. He'd seen enough orphaned children during and after the war to know he couldn't save them all, and yet he couldn't seem to make his feet move toward the door. "What's in Austin?" he found himself asking. "State orphanage," one councilman replied. "They'll be fed and clothed, might even get adopted by a proper family." Sewell had heard about such places. Crowded, cold institutions where children were often separated, especially twins. Where little white girls might find homes eventually, but little black boys never did. "Together?" he asked. "They'll stay together." The uncomfortable silence that followed was answer enough. Emma, the bolder twin, stood up, her small shoulders squared. "We promised Mama we'd always stay together. Always." Mrs. Patterson dabbed at her eyes with her apron. "It's a crying shame is what it is. Those girls belong together." Sewell looked down at his calloused hands. Hands that had fought in the war, broken wild horses, driven cattle across rivers, hands that had never held anything so fragile as a child's future. "How long until someone comes from the orphanage?" he asked. "Telegraph said 5 days, maybe a week," the sheriff answered, suspicious. 7 days. Sol had planned to be in New Mexico by then, continuing his perpetual journey westward, always moving, never attaching. "I'll stay the week," he heard himself say. "If no one in town steps forward to take them by then..." He didn't finish the sentence, unsure what he was offering. The room seemed to hold its collective breath. "You offering to take them girls yourself?" Sheriff Wade asked incredulously. "I'm offering to help find them a home," Sewell clarified, though his heart raced at the implication. "Together." The twins exchanged another of their silent communications. Sarah, the quieter one, stood up beside her sister. Together they approached Sewell, their identical faces solemn. "Please," Sarah whispered, so quietly only Sewell could hear. "Please be our daddy." Something cracked inside Sewell's chest, a fissure in the walls he'd built since the war, since he'd watched his own family torn apart. He knelt down to the girl's level, feeling the weight of the room's attention. "I'm not sure that's possible," he said honestly, "but I promise you this. I won't leave town until I know you two are safe. Together." It wasn't enough, he could see that in their eyes, but it was all he could offer, for now. The Reverend cleared his throat. Perhaps we could postpone the telegram to Austin. Give Mr. Hayes," Sewell supplied, "Solomon Hayes. Give Mr. Hayes a chance to help us explore other options." Sheriff Wade scowled. "Reverend, with all due respect, we don't know this man. He rides into town the very day we're deciding what to do with these girls. Seems mighty suspicious." "The Lord works in mysterious ways, Sheriff," the Reverend replied mildly. Emma suddenly took Sewell's large hand in her tiny one. "We need to show him our house," she announced. "Mama would want him to see it." "Now hold on," the sheriff began. "I think that's a fine idea," Mrs. Patterson interrupted, surprising everyone. "The girls need to collect their belongings anyway. Mr. Hayes can escort them, and I'll come along as chaperone if the Reverend approves." The clergyman nodded. A sensible solution. The girls should have a chance to say goodbye to their home. Sewell found himself outnumbered and outmaneuvered. Within minutes, he was walking down Cottonwood Springs' dusty main street, a twin holding each of his hands, with Mrs. Patterson following a respectable distance behind. "Our house is the white one with blue shutters," Emma informed him proudly. "Papa painted them blue for Mama's birthday." "He said they matched her eyes," Sarah added softly. "And ours." Sewell looked down at their upturned faces, their blue eyes stark against sun-browned skin, and felt another crack in his defenses. The Daniels' home sat at the edge of town, a modest clapboard structure with a small blacksmith shop attached. The yard was overgrown, the blue shutters fading, but Sewell could see it had once been a happy home. Inside, the twins moved with practiced coordination, showing Sewell their small bedroom with 2 identical beds, their mother's kitchen with carefully preserved jars of preserves, their father's workshop where half-finished projects still waited for hands that would never return. While Mrs. Patterson helped the girls gather their most precious belongings, Sewell wandered into the blacksmith shop. Thomas Daniels had been a skilled craftsman. That much was evident from the quality of his tools and the pieces displayed on shelves, intricate hinges, decorative weather vanes, practical household items elevated to art. Sewell ran his fingers over the anvil, remembering his own father's teachings at the forge during those brief years of freedom, before the war tore everything apart. He'd apprenticed as a blacksmith too, before circumstances forced him into a soldier's life. "He was teaching us," came a small voice behind him. Sewell turned to find Sarah watching him from the doorway. "Your father was teaching you smithing?" he asked, surprised. She nodded. "He said girls could learn anything boys could. Emma's better at the bellows, I'm better at the small things." She pointed to a tiny horseshoe pendant hanging on the wall. "I made that for Mama's birthday. She was wearing it when she went to heaven." Sewell knelt down. "Your father was right. And this is fine work, Sarah. Would you wear it?" she asked suddenly. "To remember us by when you go to California?" The request pierced him. "I'm not leaving yet," he reminded her gently. "But you will," she said, with the terrible certainty of a child who had learned too young that people always leave. Everyone does. Before Sewell could respond, Emma burst into the shop, her arms full of papers. "Look what I found in Mama's Bible," she exclaimed, thrusting the documents at Sewell. "It's important." Sewell carefully unfolded the papers. They were legal documents, deed to the house and shop, Thomas Daniel's will leaving everything to his wife, and a letter written in Margaret's hand, dated just days before her death. He read it slowly, his heart pounding. Margaret Daniels, knowing she was dying, had written instructions for her daughter's care. She'd named a cousin in Sacramento as their guardian, if the woman could be found. "Papa had a map," Emma said excitedly. "For California. He was saving money to take us there next year to find Mama's cousin." Sewell looked at the letter again. Margaret's cousin, Alice Campbell, had moved to Sacramento 3 years earlier. There was no guarantee she was still there or that she would take the twins, but it was hope, a direction, a purpose. "California," Sarah whispered, her eyes wide. "Like where you're going." Sewell felt the weight of possibility settling around him. He'd been drifting for 15 years, running from memories, avoiding attachments. Now these two little girls with matching braids and desperate hope were offering him something he'd never considered, a reason to reach his destination. "Mrs. Patterson," he called, his decision crystallizing with each passing moment. "Could you fetch the Reverend? I believe we need to discuss a journey." I hope you're enjoying this powerful story from the Black Rancher channel. If you are, make sure to hit that like button right now. Your support helps more people discover these forgotten chapters of American history. And if you haven't subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? Join our community of history lovers by hitting that subscribe button. Now let's get back to our story and discover what Solomon decides. By sunset, Solomon Hayes found himself in the most unlikely of scenarios, sitting in Reverend Miller's study with Sheriff Wade, the town doctor, and the two councilmen, negotiating for the guardianship of twin girls he'd met just hours before. "It's preposterous," Sheriff Wade insisted, pacing the small room. "A colored man taking 2 white children across half the country? They'd be stopped at every town, possibly arrested or worse." "I'm not proposing to adopt them," Sewell clarified, maintaining his composure despite the sheriff's thinly veiled hostility. "I'm offering to escort them to their kin in Sacramento, their mother's own wishes written in her hand." He placed Margaret Daniels' letter on the Reverend's desk. The clergyman adjusted his spectacles and read it carefully. "It does appear the girls have family," he confirmed, "though there's no guarantee this cousin is still in Sacramento or willing to take them in." "Better chance than they'd have separated in an orphanage," Sewell countered. Dr. Winters, who had remained silent until now, cleared his throat. "I attended Margaret in her final days. She spoke of this cousin Alice, said they were close as sisters growing up. If anyone would take these girls, it would be her." "Even so," Councilman Peters objected, "the journey is long and dangerous, Indians, outlaws, all manner of hazards. No place for little girls. And no proper woman would allow her children to travel with a—" Councilman Davis caught himself. "With a single man of any sort, it's improper." Sewell had anticipated this, "which is why I propose Mrs. Patterson accompany us, at least as far as the railway in Dallas. From there we can travel more safely by train much of the way." The men exchanged surprised glances. "Martha Patterson agreed to this?" the Reverend asked. "She's packing as we speak," Sewell confirmed. "Said she's been wanting to visit her sister in Denver for years. This gives her the chance, while providing the girls a proper chaperone." Sheriff Wade snorted. "And who pays for all this gallivanting across the country? Train tickets don't come cheap." Sewell reached into his vest and withdrew a small leather pouch. He upended it on the desk, revealing a collection of gold coins, his savings from 15 years of hard work and careful living. "I have means," he said simply. The room fell silent as the men stared at the gold. Even the sheriff seemed momentarily at a loss for words. "Why?" Reverend Miller finally asked, peering at Sewell over his spectacles. "Why would you do this for children you've only just met?" It was the question Sewell had been asking himself since those small voices had asked him to be their daddy. The answer came with surprising clarity. "Because someone once did the same for me," he said quietly. "After the war, when I had nothing, A white man who fought on the other side took me in, taught me ranching, gave me a chance when no one else would." He met the Reverend's gaze steadily. "I've been running ever since he died. Maybe it's time I stopped running and paid that debt forward." The Reverend nodded slowly, something like approval in his eyes. "The good book tells us to care for orphans and widows in their distress. It doesn't specify who must do the caring." "I still don't like it," the sheriff grumbled. "How do we know he'll actually take them to this cousin? How do we know he won't—" "If you're implying what I think you are," Dr. Winters interrupted sharply, "then you're insulting the man's character without cause. I've treated enough patients to know the measure of a man when I see it. Mr. Hayes here has honorable intentions." Sewell nodded gratefully to the doctor. "We could draw up papers," Councilman Peters suggested reluctantly, "a temporary guardianship. Require him to send telegrams from major stops along the way. And Mrs. Patterson's presence does satisfy propriety, at least for the first leg of the journey," the Reverend added. "Perhaps we could arrange for a series of chaperones along the route." For the next hour they hammered out details. Sewell would be granted temporary guardianship of Emma and Sarah Daniels with the explicit purpose of delivering them to their cousin in Sacramento. He would send telegrams from Dallas, Denver, Salt Lake City, and finally Sacramento, confirming their progress. Mrs. Patterson would accompany them to Dallas, and the Reverend would write ahead to clergy in major stops to arrange for suitable female chaperones for subsequent legs. The sale of the Daniels property would be delayed until word came from Sacramento in case the girls needed to return. Sewell would provide for their immediate needs from his own funds, with the promise of reimbursement if the property sold. "The girls will need to understand the arrangement," Dr. Winters cautioned as they concluded, "that Mr. Hayes is escorting them to their cousin, not becoming their permanent guardian." Sewell nodded, though a strange heaviness settled in his chest at the reminder. "They'll understand. They're remarkably intelligent children." "Then it's settled," the Reverend declared, signing the hastily drafted agreement. "You'll leave tomorrow?" "At first light," Sewell confirmed. "Better to make good time before the summer heat sets in." As the meeting disbanded, Sheriff Wade cornered Sewell outside the church. "I'll be watching until you leave town," he warned, his hand resting meaningfully on his holster. "And I'll be reading those telegrams personally. One hint that those girls aren't being treated right." "Those girls will be treated with more care than you can imagine, Sheriff," Sewell replied evenly. "I give you my word." "The word of a—" "Careful, Sheriff," Sewell interrupted, his voice still calm but with an edge of steel. "Those girls might be in my care soon. Would be a shame for them to hear their temporary guardian disrespected." The sheriff's face reddened, but he stepped back. "Just remember, I'll be watching." Sewell nodded and walked away, his mind already turning to the practical aspects of the journey ahead. He'd need supplies, a wagon for the girls and Mrs. Patterson, arrangements for his horse. He was so absorbed in planning that he almost missed the small figures waiting in the shadow of the church. Emma and Sarah stood hand in hand, their faces anxious in the fading light. "Are they sending us away?" Emma asked bluntly as Sewell approached. Sewell knelt down to their level. "No, little ones." "Not exactly." "Are you taking us with you?" Sarah's voice was barely a whisper of hope. "Yes," Sewell said, watching their faces light up. "But there's something important you need to understand." He explained as gently as he could about their mother's letter, the cousin in California, his role as temporary guardian. The joy in their expressions dimmed, but didn't disappear entirely. "So you're not going to be our daddy," Emma stated, processing this information with remarkable clarity for a 6-year-old. "I'll be your guardian," Sewell corrected carefully. "I'll protect you, care for you, and take you safely to your cousin, Alice." "But then you'll leave," Sarah concluded, the same certainty in her voice that he'd heard in the blacksmith shop. Sewell hesitated. The proper answer was yes. The arrangement was temporary, a practical solution to get them safely to their kin. Once delivered, his obligation would end. He could continue his westward journey, perhaps to Oregon or Washington, maintaining the solitude he'd grown accustomed to. But looking into those matching blue eyes, he found he couldn't make that promise. "I don't know what will happen when we reach Sacramento," he said honestly, "but I can promise you this. I won't simply drop you off and disappear. I'll make sure you're settled and happy before I decide what comes next." It wasn't what they wanted to hear. He could see that. But it was the most he could honestly offer. Emma, ever the practical one, simply nodded. "We should pack our dolls," she told her sister, apparently accepting these terms for now. Sarah lingered a moment longer, studying Saul's face with unsettling intensity. "You won't leave us before Sacramento? You promise?" "I promise," Saul said firmly. "We started this journey together, and we'll finish it together." Sarah seemed satisfied with this. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the tiny horseshoe pendant she'd shown him earlier. "For luck," she said, pressing it into his palm. "Papa said blacksmiths need luck too." Saul closed his fingers gently around the small trinket, feeling its weight far beyond its physical presence. "Thank you, Sarah. I'll keep it safe." As the twins scampered off to pack their few belongings, Saul remained kneeling in the church's shadow, the pendant warm in his hand. He'd spent 15 years avoiding attachments, responsibilities, connections of any kind. Now, in the space of a single afternoon, he'd acquired two. He wasn't their father. He couldn't be. But as he rose and tucked the horseshoe carefully into his vest pocket, he wondered if perhaps he could be something almost as important, the man who kept his promise. Dawn broke over Cottonwood Springs, painting the sky in streaks of pink and gold as Saul loaded the last of their supplies into the wagon. He'd purchased it yesterday evening from a reluctant seller, a sturdy but well-used farm wagon with a canvas cover to protect its passengers from sun and rain. It had cost him more than it was worth, but Saul hadn't bothered haggling. Some battles weren't worth fighting. Caesar, his faithful chestnut stallion, would pull the wagon. The powerful horse was accustomed to harder work than this, having helped drive cattle across the toughest terrain in Texas. Saul ran a hand along the horse's neck, taking comfort in the familiar warmth. "You ready for this, old friend?" he murmured. "Carrying precious cargo now." "Is he really old?" came a small voice. Saul turned to find Emma standing behind him, a small carpet bag clutched in her hands. Unlike yesterday, her hair was neatly braided with blue ribbons, and she wore a traveling dress that had clearly been hastily altered to fit her. "Not old," Saul explained with a smile. "Just a saying between friends who've been through a lot together." Emma nodded seriously. "Like me and Sarah." "Exactly like that," Saul agreed. "Where is your sister?" "Saying goodbye to Mama and Papa." Emma's voice wavered slightly. "At the cemetery. Mrs. Patterson took her. I already said mine." Saul knelt down. "You didn't want to go with them?" Emma shook her head firmly. "Someone had to make sure you didn't leave without us." The simple honesty of her fear struck Saul like a physical blow. "Emma, I promised I wouldn't leave you. I meant it." "People say things," she replied with the weary wisdom of a child who'd learned too many hard lessons too quickly. "Doesn't mean they do them." Saul considered her words carefully. "Your Mama and Papa, they always kept their promises to you, didn't they?" A small nod. "And they would want you to trust good people who want to help you, wouldn't they?" Another nod, more hesitant. "I made a promise to you and Sarah, and I aim to keep it. But trust takes time to build. I understand that. So you keep watching to make sure I don't leave without you if that helps you feel safer. And someday, maybe you'll see that my promises mean something." Emma studied him with those unnervingly direct blue eyes. "Papa said you can tell a man's character by his horses, if they're well-fed and not afraid." She glanced at Caesar. "Your horse looks happy." Saul felt an unexpected smile tug at his lips. "Your papa sounds like a wise man." "He was," Emma agreed. Then, with the abrupt subject change only children can manage, "Can I feed him an apple, Caesar, I mean?" "Of course," Saul said, relieved at this small sign of acceptance. He produced an apple from their supplies and showed Emma how to hold it flat on her palm. By the time Mrs. Patterson arrived with Sarah, Saul and Emma had progressed to brushing Caesar's coat together, the little girl perched on an upturned bucket to reach the horse's back. Sarah rushed forward, eager to join in, the evidence of recent tears still on her cheeks, but excitement temporarily overriding grief. "Children," Mrs. Patterson called, adjusting her traveling bonnet. Let Mr. Hayes finish his preparations. We should be on our way before the day grows too hot. Sewell helped the twins into the back of the wagon, where Mrs. Patterson had arranged a surprisingly comfortable-looking nest of quilts and pillows. The older woman climbed in after them with remarkable agility for someone her age, settling herself on a proper seat with a small valise beside her. "The Reverend will be here momentarily to see us off," she informed Sewell. "And I suspect half the town will appear as well, out of curiosity if nothing else." She was right. By the time Sewell had Caesar properly hitched to the wagon, a small crowd had gathered. The Reverend led a brief prayer for their safe journey. Dr. Winters pressed a small medical kit into Sewell's hands, just in case. Even the councilman appeared, awkwardly wishing them well. Sheriff Wade stood apart, his expression sour but resigned. As Sewell prepared to climb onto the driver's seat, the lawman approached. "First telegram from Dallas," he reminded Sewell gruffly. "Any delay and I'll have lawmen looking for you from here to California." Sewell met his gaze steadily. "We'll send word as agreed." "Good day, Sheriff." With a light flick of the reins, Sewell set the wagon in motion. The twins kneeled at the back opening of the canvas cover, waving to the town that had been their only home. Sarah clutched a small rag doll to her chest, while Emma maintained a brave face, though Sewell noticed her free hand tightly gripping her sister's. The journey had begun. The first day passed uneventfully, the wagon making steady progress along the dusty road that would eventually connect with the main trail to Dallas. Sewell kept a careful pace, mindful of his passengers' comfort. The twins alternated between quiet conversation with Mrs. Patterson, napping among their nest of quilts, and watching the landscape roll by with wide, curious eyes. By late afternoon, they'd covered a respectable 20 miles. Sewell guided the wagon off the trail toward a small creek he remembered from previous travels, a good spot to make camp, with fresh water and enough grazing for Caesar. "We'll stop here for the night," he announced, bringing the wagon to a halt beneath a stand of cottonwoods. "Already?" Emma asked, peering out at the sun still well above the horizon. "We could go further." "First rule of a long journey," Sewell explained as he climbed down, "is not to exhaust yourself on the first day. We've made good time. Now we'll rest well, so we can make good time again tomorrow." He helped Mrs. Patterson down from the wagon, then reached up for the twins. Sarah came willingly into his arms, but Emma insisted on climbing down herself, though she accepted his steadying hand. "What should we do first?" Sarah asked, looking around the unfamiliar campsite with a mixture of trepidation and excitement. Sewell considered. "Well, we need water from the creek, wood for a fire, and to get Caesar unhitched and watered." "I can help with the horse," Emma volunteered immediately. "And I can find wood," Sarah added, not to be outdone. Sewell glanced at Mrs. Patterson, who nodded her approval. "Stay within sight," he cautioned Sarah. "Only take sticks from the ground, nothing green." While Mrs. Patterson arranged their camp kitchen, Sewell showed Emma how to properly unharness Caesar and lead him to water. The little girl paid careful attention to his instructions, her small face serious with concentration. "My papa let me help with the mule sometimes," she confided as they worked. "He said I had a way with animals." "He was right," Sewell observed, watching how gently she stroked Caesar's nose. "You have a natural touch." Sarah returned with an armful of sticks, her face flushed with accomplishment. Sewell showed her how to arrange them for a proper campfire, explaining the importance of smaller kindling beneath larger pieces. As twilight deepened, they sat around the crackling fire, eating a simple meal of beans, bacon, and cornbread that Mrs. Patterson had packed. The twins ate hungrily, the day's travel having built their appetites. "Mr. Hayes," Sarah asked suddenly, "did you ever have a family?" The question caught Sewell off guard. Mrs. Patterson looked up sharply. "Sarah, that's a personal question. Mr. Hayes doesn't have to—" "It's all right," Sewell interrupted gently. He considered how to answer, looking into the expectant faces of the twins. "Yes, I had a family, a long time ago." "What happened to them?" Emma asked, as direct as always. Sewell poked at the fire, watching sparks rise into the darkening sky. "I had a mother and father and 2 younger brothers. We were separated during the war." It was a simplification of the brutal truth that his father had been killed for refusing to let Confederate soldiers take their horses, that his mother and brothers had been sold to different plantations despite promises that emancipation would come. Saul had searched for them after the war, but the trail had gone cold in Louisiana. 10 years ago, he'd finally stopped searching, though he never stopped wondering. "Did you find them again?" Sarah asked, her eyes wide in the firelight. Saul shook his head. "No, little one. I looked for many years, but some things are not meant to be." "That's why you're helping us find our cousin," Emma said with sudden understanding. "Because you couldn't find your family." Such perception from a child so young. "Perhaps that's part of it," Saul acknowledged. "I think God sent you to us," Sarah declared with absolute certainty. "Mama said God always sends help when you need it most." Mrs. Patterson nodded approvingly. "Your mama was a wise woman." Later, after the twins had fallen asleep in the wagon and Mrs. Patterson had retired to her separate partition of the canvas cover, Saul sat alone by the dying fire. He pulled Sarah's tiny horseshoe pendant from his pocket, turning it over in his fingers, feeling its perfect craftsmanship. For 15 years he'd avoided attachments, convinced they only led to pain. Yet in less than 2 days, these little girls had somehow slipped past his defenses, awakening feelings he'd long buried, protective instincts, concern, even affection. "Just to Sacramento," he reminded himself quietly. "Just getting them to family who can care for them properly." But as he tucked the pendant carefully back into his vest pocket, he wondered if his heart would remember that this arrangement was only temporary. The journey to Dallas took 5 days, each one establishing a comfortable routine. They'd rise with the sun, break camp efficiently, and travel until late afternoon, stopping at good water sources Saul remembered from his travels. The twins proved surprisingly adaptable to life on the trail, quickly learning their roles in setting up and breaking down camp, helping with Caesar and assisting Mrs. Patterson with simple cooking tasks. They passed through small settlements where curious eyes followed their unusual party. A black man driving a wagon containing an elderly white woman and 2 identical white girls. Sometimes there were muttered comments or outright challenges, but Saul had misses. Patterson kept their legal papers handy, and the sight of official documents with the Reverend's signature usually quelled immediate suspicions. On the 6th day, the Dallas skyline appeared on the horizon, a growing city that served as a major railway hub. The twins, who had never seen buildings taller than 2 stories, stared in wonder. "Are there really iron horses there?" Sarah asked, recalling stories her father had told of trains. "Indeed there are," Saul confirmed. "And tomorrow we'll be riding on one." Their first task in Dallas was sending the promised telegram to Sheriff Wade, confirming their safe arrival. Next came securing train tickets for the journey to Denver, where Mrs. Patterson would visit her sister, while Saul and the twins continued westward. The railroad agent eyed their unusual party with suspicion, until Mrs. Patterson stepped forward, explaining in her no-nonsense manner that she was escorting her late friend's children to family in California, with Mr. Hayes employed as their driver and protector. It wasn't the whole truth, but it smoothed their way. By evening, they had secured passage on the morning train, with Saul relegated to the colored car, while Mrs. Patterson and the twins would travel in the women's section of the passenger car. That night, in a modest boarding house that accepted Saul only because Mrs. Patterson insisted he was with her party, the reality of their imminent separation hit the twins hard. "Why can't you sit with us on the train?" Emma demanded, her lower lip trembling despite her attempt to appear brave. "That's just the way things are," Saul explained gently. "But I'll be on the same train, just in a different car, and I'll see you every time we stop." "It's not fair," Sarah whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "No," Saul agreed, seeing no point in pretending otherwise. "It's not fair, but we'll manage, just like we've managed everything else so far." The next morning brought their first real challenge. As they prepared to board, the conductor took one look at their party and shook his head. "Papers," he demanded curtly. Mrs. Patterson produced their documents, which the conductor examined with exaggerated thoroughness. "These say he's their temporary guardian," he said finally, pointing at Saul. "But coloreds don't get guardianship of white children. Something's not right here. The papers are in perfect order, Mrs. Patterson insisted, signed by our town's reverend and council. Don't care if God himself signed them, the conductor retorted. He ain't traveling with these children without more proof. Saul felt a familiar tension rising in his chest, the same feeling he'd experienced countless times when confronted with barriers erected solely because of his skin color. Usually, he would simply walk away, find another route, another solution that didn't require fighting a battle he couldn't win. But the twins were watching, their identical faces pinched with worry. Walking away wasn't an option. "Sir," Saul began, keeping his voice steady and respectful despite the rage building inside him. "These children lost both parents. Their mother's dying wish was for them to reach her cousin in Sacramento. I've given my word to see them safely there." "Not on my train, you won't," the conductor said dismissively, "unless you can find a white man to vouch for you." Saul was about to respond when a new voice entered the conversation. "I'll vouch for him." They turned to see a tall man in a Union Army veteran's coat approaching. His beard was gray, but his posture was military straight. "Colonel James Harrison," he introduced himself with a slight nod. "Formerly of the 1st Kansas Colored Volunteer Infantry. And you are?" "Solomon Hayes," Saul replied, recognizing the name of one of the first black regiments formed during the war. "Buffalo Soldier, 10th Cavalry." The colonel nodded, a flash of understanding passing between them. He turned to the conductor. "This man is trustworthy. I stake my reputation on it." The conductor hesitated, clearly reluctant to challenge a white veteran of his rank. "You know him personally, sir?" "I know his kind," the colonel replied firmly. "Men who fought for this country's freedom deserve better than your suspicion. Now, are you going to honor these legitimate papers? Or shall I speak with your supervisor about why the railroad is interfering with legal guardianship arrangements?" Faced with this unexpected alliance, the conductor relented, though not without a parting shot. "He still rides in the colored car, those are the rules." "Of course," the colonel agreed smoothly, "but I'll be traveling in that car as well. Been too long since I've had a good conversation with a fellow soldier." As the conductor stalked away, Saul turned to thank the unexpected ally, but Emma spoke first. "You were a soldier?" she asked the colonel, awe in her voice. "Like Mr. Hayes?" "Indeed I was, young lady," Colonel Harrison replied with a kind smile. "Though I suspect your Mr. Hayes saw far more action than I did." "Why would you ride in the colored car?" Sarah asked innocently. "Isn't it less nice?" The colonel knelt to her level, his voice gentle but serious. "Sometimes, young lady, doing what's right matters more than what's comfortable. An old soldier like me understands that." He straightened, addressing Saul directly. "I overheard your situation. My destination is Denver as well. Perhaps we could continue this conversation on the journey." And so, as the train pulled away from Dallas, Saul found himself sharing a wooden bench with Colonel Harrison in the Spartan-colored car, while Mrs. Patterson and the twins traveled in relative comfort several cars ahead. "Buffalo Soldier," the colonel remarked once they were underway. "Tough outfit. Tougher men." "Yes, sir," Saul acknowledged. "Served 8 years after the war. And now you're escorting those little girls across the country." It wasn't a question, but Saul could hear the curiosity behind it. Briefly, Saul explained the circumstances. The orphaned twins, their mother's cousin in Sacramento, his promise to deliver them safely. The colonel listened without interruption. When Saul finished, he nodded thoughtfully. "Noble undertaking, dangerous too for a man in your position." "I'm aware of the risks," Saul said simply. "I don't doubt it." The colonel studied him. "But I wonder if you're aware of the opportunity." "Opportunity, sir. Those girls look at you like you hung the moon, Hayes. Saw it in their eyes when you were arguing with that conductor. To them, you're not just a guide to California. You're something more." Saul shifted uncomfortably. "The arrangement is temporary, they understand that." "Do they?" The colonel's gaze was knowing. "Do you?" Before Saul could respond, the train began slowing for its first scheduled stop. Saul excused himself to check on the twins, finding them and Mrs. Patterson on the platform, stretching their legs during the brief stopover. "Mr. Hayes," the girls cried in unison, rushing toward him with obvious relief. "Everything all right?" he asked, noting their flushed faces. "Sarah was worried the train might leave you behind," Emma explained, rolling her eyes at her sister's concern while simultaneously clutching Saul's hand tightly. "I promised I'd stay with you until Sacramento," Saul reminded them gently. "A promise is a promise." For the remainder of the journey to Denver, Saul would join them at each stop, sometimes bringing small treats he'd purchased from platform vendors, candies or fruits the girls had never tried before. Between stops, he found himself engaged in the most stimulating conversation he'd had in years with Colonel Harrison, discussing everything from cavalry tactics to homesteading laws to the changing politics of the Western territories. 3 days later, they arrived in Denver. Mrs. Patterson's sister, a formidable woman who reminded Saul strongly of Mrs. Patterson herself, met them at the station with a carriage large enough for all of them. "My home is your home," she declared after introductions were made, including a surprisingly warm greeting for Saul. "We've plenty of room and I've already arranged for the next leg of your journey." Colonel Harrison tipped his hat in farewell. "Been a pleasure, Hayes. Give some thought to what I said." He pressed a card into Saul's hand. "My ranch is outside Sacramento. Look me up when you arrive, might have a proposition for you." That evening, in the comfort of Mrs. Patterson's sister's home, the reality of their imminent separation from Mrs. Patterson hit the twins hard. They'd grown attached to the kind older woman who had stepped in as a maternal figure since leaving Cottonwood Springs. "Why can't you come all the way to Sacramento?" Sarah asked tearfully, as Mrs. Patterson tucked them into the comfortable guest room bed. "My place is here with my sister now," Mrs. Patterson explained gently. "And your place is with your cousin Alice. Mr. Hayes will get you there safely." "But who will be our lady chaperone?" Emma asked practically, having absorbed the adults' concerns about propriety. "That's been arranged," Mrs. Patterson assured them. "The wife of a minister in Salt Lake City will accompany you on the next leg of your journey. She'll be on the same train tomorrow." Later, after the twins had finally fallen asleep, Mrs. Patterson found Saul on the porch, staring at the distant mountains silhouetted against the night sky. "They'll be heartbroken to leave you in Sacramento," she said without preamble, settling into a rocking chair beside him. Saul nodded, not trusting himself to speak. "You've grown attached to them too," she observed, "more than you expected to." "It doesn't change anything," Saul said finally. "The plan remains the same. Get them to their cousin." Mrs. Patterson studied him in the dim light. "And if their cousin isn't there or can't take them?" It was a possibility Saul had considered with increasing frequency as they traveled westward. "Then we'll find another solution, a good home for them." "They already believe they've found a good home," Mrs. Patterson said softly. "With you." Saul shook his head. "A black man can't adopt white children. You know that." "Perhaps not legally in most places," she conceded. But Colonel Harrison mentioned land available in some of the newer territories, places where the rules aren't so established. Saul turned to look at her, surprised. "You've been thinking about this?" "I've been watching," she corrected. "Watching you with those girls, watching them with you. Some families are made, Mr. Hayes, not born, and I've rarely seen one fitting together as naturally as you three." She rose from her chair, patting his shoulder as she passed. "Just something to consider on the remainder of your journey. Good night, Mr. Hayes." Saul remained on the porch long after she'd gone inside, Colonel Harrison's card heavy in his pocket, Mrs. Patterson's words even heavier in his heart. The remainder of the journey passed in a blur of changing landscapes, train connections, and a succession of female chaperones arranged through Reverend Miller's network of clergy. From Denver to Salt Lake City, from there to Reno, and finally to Sacramento, the twins adapted to each new leg with remarkable resilience, though they increasingly turned to Saul for security and comfort. Saul sent telegrams as promised from each major stop, reporting their progress to Sheriff Wade. The replies were terse but indicated the sheriff was satisfied with their adherence to the agreement. As they approached Sacramento, Saul found himself torn. Part of him hoped they would find Alice Campbell easily, that she would welcome her cousin's children with open arms, providing them the stable, conventional home they deserved. Another part, a part he scarcely admitted to himself, dreaded that very outcome. "We arrive tomorrow," he told the twins, as they prepared for bed in their Sacramento-bound train compartment, their current chaperone dozing in the corner. "First thing, we'll start looking for your cousin Alice." "What if we don't find her?" Sarah asked, the question that had clearly been weighing on both girls' minds. "Then we'll figure out what comes next," Sewell answered honestly. "Together." Emma, who had been unusually quiet as they neared their destination, suddenly looked up from the doll she was clutching. "We could stay with you," she said, her voice small but determined. "We wouldn't be any trouble." Sewell sat on the edge of their berth, choosing his words carefully. "Emma, Sarah, you know I care for you both very much. These weeks together have been special, but—" "You don't want us," Sarah interrupted, tears welling. "That's not true," Sewell said firmly. "Not true at all. But wanting isn't always enough. There are laws, customs. It's complicated." "Because your skin is brown and ours is pink?" Emma asked with characteristic directness. Sewell nodded slowly. "That's part of it." "That's stupid," Emma declared, with the simple moral clarity of childhood. "Papa said what matters is what's in a person's heart, not what they look like." "Your papa was a wise man," Sewell agreed, his own heart aching, "but not everyone thinks that way." Sarah, who had been listening intently, suddenly climbed into Sewell's lap, her small arms wrapping around his neck. "Please don't leave us," she whispered against his shoulder. "Please be our daddy." The same words she'd spoken that first day in Mrs. Patterson's boarding house. The words that had started this journey. Sol held her gently, feeling Emma press against his side, her small hand finding his. "Let's see what tomorrow brings," he said finally, unable to make promises he might not be able to keep. "Try to get some sleep now." But sleep eluded Saul that night as the train rushed towards Sacramento. By dawn, when they pulled into the station, he had made no decision beyond finding Alice Campbell. That was the first priority. Everything else would have to wait. Sacramento in 1885 was a bustling city of nearly 30,000, the commercial and political hub of Northern California. Saul arranged lodging near the station, then began the methodical process of locating Alice Campbell. City directories, inquiries at churches, visits to neighborhoods mentioned in Margaret Daniels' letter. For 3 days they searched, the twins growing increasingly anxious with each dead end. Their current chaperone, the wife of a local Baptist minister, accompanied them during the day but returned to her home each evening, leaving Saul to comfort the increasingly despondent girls. On the 4th day, they finally found a promising lead. A shopkeeper remembered an Alice Campbell who had worked as a seamstress nearby. "Moved to a ranch outside town about a year ago," he recalled. "Married a widower with land near Folsom. Name of Miller or Miller, something like that." Armed with this information, Sewell hired a buggy the next morning, and they set out for Folsom, about 20 miles east of Sacramento. The twins were unusually quiet during the journey, each lost in her own thoughts. The Miller Ranch wasn't difficult to find once they reached Folsom, a prosperous-looking spread with well-maintained fences and a handsome 2-story farmhouse. Saul felt both relief and a strange disappointment as they approached. This was clearly a good home, one where the twins would be well provided for. A woman was hanging laundry in the yard as they drove up, a boy of about 4 playing at her feet. She looked up at the sound of the buggy, shading her eyes against the morning sun. "Mrs. Miller," Sewell called as he brought the buggy to a halt. "Yes," she replied, wiping her hands on her apron and approaching cautiously, gathering her son behind her skirts. "Alice Miller, formerly Campbell," Sewell clarified. "Cousin to Margaret Daniels from Texas." The woman's expression changed from wariness to shock. "Margaret, is she—" "I'm afraid Mrs. Daniels passed away some months ago," Sewell said gently, helping the twins down from the buggy. "These are her daughters, Emma and Sarah." Alice's hands flew to her mouth, her eyes filling with tears as she looked at the twins. "Oh my heavens," she whispered. "The last time I saw you girls, you were just babies." The twins pressed closer to Sewell, suddenly shy in the presence of this stranger who was supposedly their family. "Please come inside," Alice urged, recovering herself. "My husband's out with the hands, but he'll be back for dinner. We have so much to discuss." Inside the comfortable farmhouse, over coffee for the adults and milk with cookies for the children, Sewell explained the circumstances that had brought them to California. Alice listened with growing distress, occasionally wiping away tears. "Poor Margaret," she said when Sewell finished. "We wrote regularly for years, but the letters slowed after Thomas died. I had no idea she was ill." She turned her attention to the twins, who had been mostly silent, observing this unknown cousin with wary eyes. "You poor darlings. What a journey you've had." As Alice attempted to engage the girls in conversation, Sewell studied her. She seemed kind, genuinely moved by her cousin's fate, and the home appeared prosperous and well kept. The little boy, Alice's stepson, she explained, was clearly well cared for. By all objective measures, this was exactly what they had hoped to find. Yet the twins remained reserved, answering Alice's questions politely but briefly, their eyes frequently darting to Sewell, as if seeking reassurance or permission. "Mr. Hayes has been taking care of us," Emma finally volunteered when Alice asked about their journey. "He promised Mama he would find you." "And he keeps his promises," Sarah added, with fierce loyalty. Alice glanced at Sewell, something like understanding in her expression. "It seems you've been a godsend to these girls, Mr. Hayes." Before Sewell could respond, hoofbeats announced the arrival of Alice's husband. Moments later, a tall man with a weathered face and salt and pepper hair entered the kitchen. "James!" Alice exclaimed. "These are Margaret's daughters, Emma and Sarah, and this is Mr. Hayes, who brought them all the way from Texas." James Miller surveyed the scene, his expression unreadable as his gaze settled on Sewell. "You brought these girls across the country by yourself?" "Yes, sir," Sewell replied, standing, "with the assistance of several female chaperones along the way." Miller's eyes narrowed. "And your interest in this matter is—" "James," Alice admonished. "Mr. Hayes has done an incredible service bringing the girls to us. Just making sure everything's above board," Miller said, his tone softening slightly. "You understand? A colored man traveling with white children raises questions." Sewell had expected this reaction, had faced versions of it throughout their journey. "I have documentation," he said evenly, producing the papers that had seen them safely across the country. "Temporary guardianship with the explicit purpose of delivering the girls to their kin." Miller examined the papers thoroughly before handing them back with a nod. "Seems in order. You've fulfilled your obligation then." The words hung in the air, their implication clear. Sewell's role was now complete. The twins had found their family. His guardianship had ended. Emma suddenly stood up, her small face flushed. "We want to stay with Mr. Hayes," she announced, her voice trembling but determined. Sarah nodded vigorously beside her. "He's our family now." A painful silence followed this declaration. Alice looked stricken, while her husband's expression darkened. The twins stood shoulder to shoulder, identical in their defiance. "Girls," Sewell began gently, "Mrs. Miller is your mother's cousin. She's your family by blood." "You're our family by heart," Sarah countered, using her father's phrase. "You promised you wouldn't leave us." "I promised to get you safely to your cousin," Sewell corrected, though each word felt like a betrayal. "And I have." Alice, sensing the growing tension, intervened. "It's been a long journey for everyone. Perhaps we should all take some time to consider what's best." She turned to Sewell. "Mr. Hayes, you're welcome to stay for dinner, and overnight if you wish. There's a cabin the hands use during harvest that's empty now." Miller looked like he might object, but subsided at his wife's pointed look. "Of course," he agreed with obvious reluctance. "Least we can do." The remainder of the day passed in strained politeness. Alice showed the twins the room they would share, filled with thoughtful touches, dolls on the beds, a small bookshelf with children's stories, curtains with a pattern of horses that she thought they might like, given their father's profession. The girls accepted these offerings with quiet thanks, but remained withdrawn, staying close to Sewell whenever possible. When it came time for dinner, they insisted on sitting on either side of him, barely touching the food Alice had prepared especially for them. After the meal, as the sun began to set, Sewell suggested a walk to the twins. "We need to talk," he said gently. "Just the three of us." They followed him eagerly out to the orchard behind the house, where apple trees were heavy with nearly ripe fruit. When they were a sufficient distance from the house, Sewell knelt down to their level. "Your cousin Alice seems like a kind woman," he began carefully. "And this is a good home. You'd have everything you need here. Safety, comfort, education. We need you," Emma said simply. Sewell closed his eyes briefly, gathering his strength. "I can't give you what they can. I don't have a home property stability I've been wondering for 15 years. "Then stop wondering," Sarah suggested, as if it were the simplest solution in the world. "Stay here with us." "It's not that simple, little one." "Because you're black and we're white?" Emma asked, echoing their conversation on the train. Sewell nodded slowly. "That's a big part of it. The world doesn't make it easy for families that look different." "But we're already a family," Sarah insisted, tears spilling down her cheeks. "You said so." Had he? Perhaps not in those exact words, but somewhere along their journey west, the three of them had indeed become something like a family. Against all his intentions, despite all his efforts to maintain emotional distance, these two little girls had claimed a place in his heart. "I care for you both more than I can say," Sewell admitted, his own voice rough with emotion. "These past weeks they've changed me, but caring isn't always enough." Emma, practical as always, squared her shoulders. "Colonel Harrison said you could work on his ranch. Remember? He gave you his card." Sewell blinked in surprise. "You heard that conversation?" Emma nodded. "He said he had a proposition," Sewell supplied. "Yes, that. For when we got to Sacramento." Sewell had almost forgotten the Colonel's parting words in Denver, the card still tucked in his vest pocket alongside Sarah's horseshoe pendant. A ranch outside Sacramento, a proposition. "Even if I stayed in the area," Sewell said carefully, "it wouldn't change the fact that your cousin is your legal family now." "We could visit you," Sarah suggested, hope blooming in her eyes. "Every day." "Or you could visit us," Emma added, "and teach us more about horses." Sewell felt something inside him giving way, the last of his resistance, perhaps. The walls he'd built over 15 years of solitude crumbling in the face of these children's simple, unwavering love. Before he could respond, a voice called from the direction of the house. "Mr. Hayes, girls, dessert is ready." They returned to find apple pie waiting, but the twins picked at it listlessly, the excitement from their conversation in the orchard fading as the reality of their situation reasserted itself. Soon after, Alice suggested it was bedtime for the children. "Can Mr. Hayes tuck us in?" Sarah asked immediately. Alice hesitated, glancing at her husband, who frowned but nodded slightly. Sewell followed the twins upstairs to their new room, feeling the weight of impending separation with each step. He sat on the edge of the bed as they climbed in, still in their day dresses, too emotionally exhausted for proper bedtime routines. "Will you at least say goodbye before you leave?" Emma asked, her voice small in the dimly lit room. "Of course," Sewell promised, his heart breaking. "I wouldn't leave without saying goodbye." Sarah reached for his hand. "Tell us a story, like you did on the trail." Sewell nodded, gathering his composure. He began the tale of a buffalo who longed to fly, one of their favorites from the journey. The twins listened with heavy eyes, fighting sleep even as exhaustion claimed them. When they had finally drifted off, Sewell remained sitting between their beds, watching their peaceful faces in the lamplight. They looked so small, so vulnerable, and yet they had shown more courage and resilience on this journey than many grown men he'd known. A soft knock at the door roused him from his thoughts. Alice stood in the doorway, beckoning him to join her in the hallway. "They're very attached to you," she observed quietly, once Sewell had gently closed the bedroom door. "The journey was difficult," Sewell explained. "We relied on each other." Alice studied him thoughtfully. "It's more than that, I think. My cousin's daughters have chosen you as their family. That's no small thing." Sewell sighed heavily. "Mrs. Miller." "Alice, please." "Alice. I know what's best for them is to stay here with blood kin, in a stable home where they'll be accepted." "Is that what's best?" she asked, surprising him. Or is it what's expected? Sewell had no immediate answer. My husband and I have discussed the situation, Alice continued. James is traditional in his thinking, but he's not unkind. He sees how the girls respond to you and how you care for them. What are you suggesting? Sewell asked cautiously. The property adjoining ours came available recently. 20 acres with a small cabin, nothing fancy. James considered purchasing it to expand our orchard, but hasn't moved on it yet. She met Sewell's gaze directly. If you were to acquire it, the girls could divide their time. Live here officially, but visit you regularly. As they grow older, they could decide for themselves where they feel most at home. Sewell stared at her, momentarily speechless. I would consider such an arrangement. They're Margaret's daughters, Alice said simply. I want what would make them happy, and I think having you in their lives would make them very happy indeed. I don't have the means to purchase property, Sewell admitted. Most of my savings went to this journey. Alice smiled. Colonel Harrison's ranch borders our land to the north. He's been looking for a skilled horseman to manage his breeding program, someone who understands quality stock. Sol's mind raced. You know the Colonel. Everyone in these parts knows Colonel Harrison. He's an unusual man with progressive ideas, employs all manner of folk on his ranch, judges them by their work, not their background. Alice's expression turned thoughtful. The cabin on that adjoining property needs work, but it's sound. With a steady position at the Colonel's ranch, you could make it a proper home within a year. A home. The word resonated in Sewell's chest like a bell. When was the last time he'd had a real home? Not just a place to sleep between journeys, but somewhere that anchored him to the world. It's not a perfect solution, Alice acknowledged. There would be talk, challenges. But California isn't Texas. Things are different here, not perfect, but different. Why would you do this? Sewell asked, still struggling to understand her offer. You don't know me. I know what I've seen today, Alice replied. A man who brought 2 orphaned children safely across the country, who clearly loves them as his own, and whom they love in return. She smiled sadly. Margaret's letter said you would help find me, but I think perhaps you were meant to find something else as well. Before Sewell could respond, the bedroom door creaked open slightly. 2 identical faces peered out, eyes wide and hopeful in the dim hallway light. Were you listening? Sewell asked, though he already knew the answer. The twins nodded in unison, not a trace of remorse on their faces. Can we stay with you sometimes? Sarah asked, her voice tremulous with hope. Like Cousin Alice said. Sewell looked from the twins to Alice, feeling the full weight of the decision before him. The safe choice would be to leave tomorrow, return to his solitary existence, convince himself this was best for everyone. The path of least resistance. But as he reached into his pocket and felt the small horseshoe pendant Sarah had given him for luck, he knew he had already made his choice. Perhaps he'd made it the moment 2 small voices had asked him to be their daddy. If your cousin and her husband agree, and if Colonel Harrison still has that position available, Sewell began carefully. He didn't get to finish. The twins burst from the doorway and threw themselves at him, small arms wrapping tightly around his waist, identical faces beaming up at him through happy tears. Does this mean you'll be our daddy now? Emma asked bluntly. Sewell exchanged a glance with Alice, who nodded encouragement. It means, he said, kneeling down to their level, that I'll be in your lives for as long as you want me there. We'll figure out exactly what that looks like together, all of us. Forever, Sarah declared with absolute certainty. We want you forever. As Sewell gathered the twins into his arms, he felt something settle in his soul, a sense of rightness, of belonging, that had eluded him for 15 years. The journey that had begun with a reluctant promise in a Texas boarding house had led him not just across the country, but to the family he never expected to find. The path ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be obstacles, prejudices to overcome, difficult conversations and compromises. But looking at the hopeful faces of Emma and Sarah Daniels, Sewell knew with absolute certainty that every step would be worth it. Sometimes the most unlikely heroes are the ones who stop. And sometimes in the stopping they find exactly what they never knew they were searching for. If this story touched your heart, please hit that like button and share it with someone who needs to hear it. These untold histories of the American West deserve to be remembered and celebrated. I want to thank you for spending this time with me on the Black Rancher channel. Your support means the world, and it allows me to continue bringing these powerful stories to life. Subscribe if you haven't already, and ring that bell to be notified when our next journey into the past begins. So until next time, remember that family isn't always about blood. Sometimes it's about who stops when everyone else keeps walking.